So in this talk, I want to look at some of the ways in which the web is changing and at how our work is changing alongside it. I want to talk about web design as an agent of power and to look at its capacity to do harm. I would like to suggest to you today that web design has, as a practice, become industrialized, and I want to look at how that will change the nature of our work in the months and years to come. I want to talk about how the web has always excelled at creating new kinds of work and then rendering that work and its workers invisible. And then I want to talk a little bit about hope. But I'd actually like to start with something completely different by showing you one of my very favorite things in nature. You see, this is a starling. Now, starlings are small birds, and they're also incredibly common ones at that. In fact, they can be found on nearly every continent. But many starlings actually have this beautiful metallic shine, which is actually quite breathtaking when the light catches them just so. Now, generally speaking, starlings are actually known to be incredibly mischievous and actually quite intelligent. Their bird song, syntactically speaking, is actually quite complex, and starlings are skilled mimics. But that's, in fact, not what I want to talk about today. Because what happens when a group of starlings takes flight, I really wish I had the words to describe it. You see, a flock of starlings has an absolutely beautiful name. It's called a murmuration of starlings. And this is one of the most complex flocking mechanisms known in nature, and to me it almost feels like something entirely different than birds in the air. It feels a bit like watching a current of water, or an avalanche that's moving in slow motion, or maybe even a billow of dust that's a light on the wind. Now, a murmuration could be several dozen starlings, a few hundred, or as many as several thousand, all moving as though in unison, tracing these ethereal, ghostly shapes in the air. Now, mechanically speaking, a murmuration is actually relatively simple. When a neighbor moves, so do you. And that action cascades up from an individual bird and ripples upward and outward to quite literally shape the entire flock. But the name might actually be the most beautiful thing, or at least it's my favorite thing, because it's taken from the sound of the flock that it makes as it moves. The sound of a murmuration actually sounds like a quiet, gentle voice that's whispering in the air at you across a great distance. Now, individually speaking, starlings are beautiful, but collectively, starlings become a wonder. Now, I've been thinking a lot about starlings and their murmurations recently, especially as my work over the last few years has shifted to working with more and more design systems, because really, at the end of the day, a design system is all about finding beauty in these tiny, seemingly isolated and separate parts. We design these patterns, which are effectively little responsive layouts themselves, and we work to understand their needs, how they might change and adapt across different breakpoints, or working with different content or different languages. And then I love that my work has begun by focusing on the small and the seemingly disconnected, because as a designer, I found that there's some incredible delight to be found in those details. Now, for just one example of that, let's talk a little bit about drop caps. Now, I was assigned a bug in a design system that I've been working on recently, and that bug report actually had 3 screenshots associated with it. Now, maybe you can see the issue already, but I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. So these were screenshots that were taken in 3 separate browsers: Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. And let me turn on borders just to really highlight the issue. Or more specifically speaking, it's 2 issues. You see, in Firefox, we actually have a nice tight box around the shape of the letter form, and that's the effect that we'd like to ultimately achieve across all 3 browsers. Unfortunately, Firefox is the outlier here, and in Chrome and Safari, we can see the second issue. Those are sized more consistently, but the heights of those boxes are actually much too tall. So what's actually happening here? Well, if we look under the hood of these design patterns, basically we can actually see that there's another fairly common pattern itself generating these drop caps. Here, the author is actually using the first letter pseudo-selector to select, wait for it, the first letter, and then actually style it, applying that nice, really healthy-looking serif and making it very visually prominent and floating it off to the left. So this is one pattern, but bear with me for a second. What happens if we change our approach just very slightly? What happens if we inject a little bit of physical markup into this content and surround the letter that we want to style, and then style that spans directly itself? Now, I'll be the first to tell you that semantically speaking, this is much more ungainly, but again, just bear with me for a second. What happens if we go back to the design? Now, that's interesting. Simply by changing our approach, just that little tiny tweak, we now have consistent heights across the board, all just by introducing a little bit of markup. Now, we still have the second issue to deal with, right? We still have the ungainly height of the box, those awkward spaces above and below the letter that we need to close up. So how do we actually do that? Well, it wasn't until I found a blog entry by someone named Vincent de Oliveira that I actually figured out what was happening and, more importantly, how to adjust the issue. You see, Vincent explained in his post that every glyph in a font, every number, every letter, every character is drawn on something that's called an M-square, which is basically a box that acts as a kind of coordinate plane that the letter form is then drawn upon. And so that's the box that's actually being reserved for our drop caps, and that's what's making them appear too tall. Because you see, every M-square has space reserved at the top and bottom of the box for letters ascenders or descenders, which we don't actually need for our drop caps. So basically, we need to remove those spaces and leaving just enough room for that initial letter. Now, thankfully, since we actually moved to introducing a little bit of span here, we have some actual markup in place that we can target. So we can actually use the before and after pseudo selectors to quite literally target those areas of the box and use negative margins to basically draw the letter form up to the outer edges of that box, closing up those gaps and completing the effect across all three browsers. And with that, I think we can say that we're done. Or are we? Here's the thing to remember, that we finished the visual treatment of this design pattern, but as we heard from Marcy and so many other speakers today, on the web, we're not just serving sighted users. We're designing for users who may not browse the web like I do, who may not see the web like I do. So how does this design sound, just for an example? I have a little bit of audio on this side. I'm not sure if it's coming through. Let's try that again.
And Athu watched the storm. So beautiful yet terrific.
It was worth the wait, wasn't it? I mean, it's a really interesting effect, though. Let me just play it one more time.
And Athu watched the storm. So beautiful yet terrific.
So what's happening here? Now, the reason this is happening is because some assistive technology notices the markup that we introduced around our first letter and interprets it as a completely separate, discrete word. So that's what Apple's voice-over screen readers is actually doing inside of this recording that I made. We hear M, and then the rest of the word, Athu.
And Athu watched the storm. So beautiful yet terrific.
So instead of just focusing on the visual presentation of this particular design pattern, we in fact need to provide markup that better describes our content for all of our users. And after a little bit of experimentation, this is where we landed. Okay, sure, I realize this seems like a lot, but bear with me for a second. Because really, at the end of the day, amidst all this sort of like robotic-looking markup, there's actually only two things that are actually happening here. First and foremost, we're treating the visual presentation of this design pattern, the drop cap itself, as a purely visual element. We're using that ARIA hidden attribute to, well, hide the element from assistive technology, and that will prevent the split word from being announced. The second part is also kind of interesting, I think. We're using this ARIA labeled by attribute, which is attached to the outer container for the entire pattern, and that points to the first real word, which is visually hidden. And so thanks to that ARIA labeled by attribute, that word acts as a kind of label for this entire chunk of markup. So VoiceOver and other kinds of assistive technology will simply read the markup as Matthew. And now with some richer markup in place, we now have a finished design, one that I would argue would actually looks as good as it sounds.
Matthew watched the storm. So beautiful yet terrific.
And now I think we can consider our job done. Now I'd like to acknowledge something about this. You know, as the designer, I have an incredible amount of power throughout this entire process. Now, I'll be the first to admit that power is a word we don't use very much in our industry. I mean, after all, I think it's hard for us to think of ourselves as web designers or web developers as powerful, right? I mean, so much of our work is beholden to clients, to tight deadlines, to our audiences, to our products. So what do I mean in this case by power? Well, I mean, quite literally, it's the ability to exert some influences, to change behavior. As I worked through these drop caps, the way in which I designed this pattern determined who was going to be able to access my work. And at the same time, it was going to determine who would be excluded from using it. I'm shaping how usable this content, how usable this interface is going to be through my actions, through my decisions. Now, this power applies to drop caps, that's very true, but it also applies to quite literally everything we design and build for the World Wide Web. And it's all too easy to design something that excludes people, as we heard from Marcy earlier today. But it also extends beyond the simple markup choices that we make. I mean, maybe our sites are too heavy and won't load for people who have limited data plans or slow connections. Or maybe someone does need assistive technology to browse the web and our interfaces simply won't meet their needs. Now, it doesn't matter if we don't mean to exclude someone, unfortunately. As my friend and colleague Deb Chatra once said, any sufficiently advanced neglect is indistinguishable from malice. And I think part of the issue we are dealing with as an industry here is that we don't talk nearly enough about the power that we have in the design that we do. And part of the problem, I think, is the way that we talk about web design as a concept. In our industry, we tend to talk about it as something that's pure or apolitical. But unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. For one example of the ways in which power can influence design, I'd like to talk for a moment about a man named Robert Moses. Now, if you're not familiar with Moses, he was a massively influential public official in the middle of the 20th century in New York City. And he held a very long and productive tenure. And he was, among other things, the New York City Parks Commissioner, overseeing countless public construction projects, like the Triborough Bridge, like Shea Stadium, like Flushing Meadows Park, which was the site of New York's two World's Fairs. And Moses was actually instrumental in getting the United Nations to locate its headquarters in Manhattan. Moses came to be known over the course of his career as the master builder of New York. He quite literally reshaped the city, and the effects of his work can still be seen in effect today. Moses was also an avowed racist. Now, his biographer actually once said that, and I quote, "Moses had always displayed contempt for people he felt were considerably beneath him." I'm not going to quote the many terrible, vile things that Moses has said over his lifetime. But instead, I will note that many of Moses' public works projects were intentionally and deliberately placed out of reach of New York communities that were predominantly black or Hispanic. I would like you to keep that in mind as we look at just one example of Moses' work. Now, this is one of the overpasses Moses built on the Long Island Parkway. Now, Robert Moses himself specified that the height of these overpasses must be low, some with clearances as low as 7 feet 7 inches. And if I was to reach my hand above my head, that should give you some indication of how punishingly low this is. So why so low? Well, Moses wanted to ensure that buses would never be able to pass beneath these underpasses. In other words, you could access the beautiful parks of Long Island if you owned a car, which in the middle of the 20th century meant that you were fairly affluent and almost certainly white. Moses' design of these overpasses meant that if you relied on mass transit, in other words, if you were black or poor or both, you would be prevented from accessing the parkways and the lovely parks they led to. Throughout history, there are many, many instances of design being used exactly as Robert Moses used it, as a means to encode racist and classist biases, as a vehicle through which vulnerable communities are harmed. But that's more than enough about Robert Moses now. Now I'd like to show you one map. Now, this is a map of Cleveland, Ohio, here in the United States, and it was actually drawn just a few short years ago by a nonprofit here in America called the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. The pink areas on the map, if you're able to see it behind me, represent communities where more than 35% of residents live below the poverty line. The green areas of the map represent areas where AT&T deployed high-speed fiber networks. You'll notice that there's almost no overlap between those two regions. In pursuit of profits, a business prioritized deploying its high-speed networks in areas of the city that would yield the greatest financial return. And this, too, is a kind of design. I mean, functionally speaking, it's exactly the same as Robert Moses' work. It's enforcing structural biases against the poor and excluding them from accessing the internet with the same ease, the same speed as other more affluent citizens. So whether we're discussing Robert Moses or telecommunication companies or, yes, even drop caps, we need to sit with the fact that although design has a very rich and long history of providing solutions, it is also capable of visiting great harm upon people, of packaging bias and cementing inequalities. In other words, we have to look at design as an agent of power, as something that's capable of good, that's absolutely true, but of something that's just as capable of harm as well. I mean, even if we don't always mean to do it, our work can privilege the privileged and exclude marginalized populations. We have to talk about the power that we possess as designers, as developers, and we have to work in everything that we do to wield that power responsibly. Now, the reason that I wanted to talk with you today about power instead of responsive design is that it feels to me a little bit like something has shifted in our industry in recent years. For just a few examples of this, let's look at a few things some of our industry's most successful companies did last year in 2018. Let's start with Amazon. Now, in May of 2018, it was discovered that Amazon had developed its own facial recognition software called Recognition and had begun selling it to law enforcement agencies in the United States. Additionally, in November of last year, it was discovered that Amazon had filed a patent in which its Ring doorbells, which have a camera embedded in them, could use that same recognition software to alert homeowners and police of suspicious activities and people. This despite the fact that the software was tested by the American Civil Liberties Union to have identified over 24 members of the United States Congress as criminals, many of whom were people of color. And next, we come to Google. In May of last year, it was discovered that Google was attempting to bid on contracts for the United States Pentagon, specifically for something called Project Maven. Now, Google was bidding to provide artificial intelligence capabilities that could interpret video images, which could in turn be used to improve the targeting and accuracy of drone strikes. And shortly thereafter, various internal leaks started to surface about something called Project Dragonfly. Now, if you haven't heard of it, it was a secret initiative to create a censored and trackable version of Google's search engine for release in China. This initiative was roundly and immediately condemned by human rights organizations across the globe. And according to an open letter signed by that coalition, if such features were launched, there was a real risk that Google would directly assist the Chinese government in arresting or imprisoning people simply for expressing their views online, making the company complicit in human rights violations. And on that front, let's turn briefly to Facebook. Now, in the last year, Facebook had a number of massive user data breaches that hit the headlines, and more revelations came out about the use of the platform for coordinated political attacks. But the one thing I want to call your attention to happened in September of last year, in which UN human rights investigators issued a report stating that Myanmar's military had targeted its population of Rohingya Muslims with mass killings and gang rapes with, and I quote, genocidal intent. And in that same report, it said that Facebook had been instrumental in facilitating that hatred. And they said, the role of social media is significant. Facebook has been a useful instrument for those seeking to spread hate in a context where, for most users, Facebook is the internet. Well, I don't know about you, but it's easy for me to look at last year's events and to feel despair, I guess. I mean, this doesn't feel like the industry I grew up in. The web just feels, to me, a little bit darker now. And that does feel like it stands in contrast with the industry that I started in, the industry that gave me a career, because in the early days, the way we talked about the web as a medium was rooted in so much optimism. Actually, there's a really great recent example of this. I mean, maybe you remember this moment from the 2012 Olympics.
Here's the culmination of this sequence, 1,400 volunteer cast, paying tribute to this man, really, because he's the one who changed the way we all communicate today. So Tim Berners-Lee, the British scientist who invented the World Wide Web and created the first website in the world in 1990. This is for everyone.
It should give you some indication of how much fun I am at parties. So when I saw this for the first time, I stood up in my living room and I cheered. But I mean, really, for me in this moment, I mean, there was something magical about it. I mean, here's this guy, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web, standing before the world and proclaiming that this is for everyone. And it epitomized the way that we thought about the web as an industry, that it wasn't just a communications network, that it was an ideal. But the thing is that I don't feel that ideal much anymore, not these days. I mean, maybe it's just me. I mean, I've become an old man in this industry after all, but I don't think it is just me. I feel there really has been a shift of late, that the web I grew up in looks very, very different than the web as it stands today. But here's something I've realized, that we got to this point, this low point, I would argue, in part because the web's evolution has been following a kind of pattern. Now, not a design pattern, mind you, it's a historical pattern. And it's one that has a profound effect on the web, on our industry, on our work, and on us. And if we can understand that pattern and its trajectory, that's going to go a long way to helping us understand how we got here and maybe just as importantly, how we might potentially move forward. Let me start with this. Are you familiar with Ursula Franklin? I mean, if you're not, she was amazing. She was a metallurgist, a physicist, a university professor, a writer, a feminist, a social critic, a social historian, and frankly speaking, she was generally one of the most inspiring and most accomplished people that I know of. And amidst everything else that she did over the course of this amazing career that she had, she was the author of one of my very favorite books, which was called The Real World of Technology. And this is one of those books that I really wish that I read in the early days of my career. It's a remarkable look at technology, not as an abstract concept, but as a social force, one that can shape people's lives. Now, in the book, Franklin argues a lot of ground, but she suggests, in addition to that every technology in human history has aged in the same exact fashion, passing through 3 distinct stages of development, each of them marked by the technology's relationship to society as a whole. Now, if I was going to be so bold as to slap labels on these stages, I think you could break them down like this: advocacy, adoption, and institutionalization. Now, the first stage is one where technology is first introduced to society and everything is shiny and new. Early adopters explain how wonderful and helpful a technology might be and engender a real sense of excitement around it. That advocacy and optimism plants the seed for widespread adoption. That brings us to the second phase, which is what happens as a technology gains traction in a society. Standards become established, and infrastructures are put in place to support and encourage that new technology as it scales. And the third phase is what happens when a technology achieves an institutional status. At this point, a technology is no longer optional. In fact, it's an expectation, a necessity. And at this point, a technology can become so stabilized it becomes stagnant. Now, here's the important thing to note about this trajectory, that as a technology matures, that promise of liberation that's made in the first phase is never, ever fulfilled. Here's one example that Franklin cites in her book. Now, this was from an article that was written in 1860. The sewing machine will, after some time, effectively banish ragged and unclad humanity from every class. In all benevolent institutions, these machines are now in operation and do, or may do, 100 times more towards clothing the indigent and feeble than the united fingers of all the charitable and willing ladies collected throughout the civilized world could possibly perform. Now, this was being written at a time where the sewing machine was being introduced to the general public for the very first time, and most of the language used at that time was basically proposing that the sewing machine would free women of the toils and drudgery of hand sewing. But there's also something else happening here as well. The authors of this article were actually claiming that the sewing machine would end poverty. And remember that this was written in 1860. Poverty is still sadly going strong. But here's something else that's interesting. If you fast forward a few short decades, here we have a pamphlet for a Singer sewing machine. And in that pamphlet, they're advertising that a female operator could use this machine to produce 3,300 stitches per square minute. So in the span of a few short decades, the messaging around sewing machines basically shifted from talking about personal liberty to technical efficiency. So why the change? Well, let's look at the machine in context, because at this time, the sewing of clothing was actually being done at a truly industrial scale for the very first time, and that work wasn't being primarily done in the home, but in factories and in sweatshops that exploited the labor of women and immigrants. Now, this industrialization of clothing required a classic division of labor. One seamstress would only sew up sleeves, another worker would sew the sleeves to the shirt, another worker would cut buttonholes, and then yet another worker would press the finished shirts. And then, as the industry evolves, those individual tasks, the sewing, the cutting, the pressing, became increasingly automated, excluding people altogether. Throughout history, people are promised that technology will free them, but ultimately, as the technology matures, it captures them, and then it exploits them. What I'd like to propose is that what happened with the sewing machine is currently happening with the World Wide Web. That the web is becoming industrialized in the same exact way that the sewing machine was. And it's following the same precise pattern that Ursula Franklin outlined in her book. In fact, there's a really great example of this in the mission statement of the Web Foundation, which was a nonprofit founded by Sir Tim Berners-Lee to advocate for an open, democratically available web. And that mission statement says that we envision a world where all people are empowered by the web. The web's capabilities will multiply and play an increasingly vital role in reducing poverty and conflict, improving healthcare and education, reversing global warming, spreading good governance, and addressing all challenges, local and global. Now, I don't think we have to squint too hard to see how these statements resonate with the introduction of the sewing machine. Now, I don't want to stand up here and deny the web's potential. I think it is a truly revolutionary medium, and I mean, heck, it gave me a career. And chances are good it gave you one too. But I think it's worth asking ourselves that if this is the promise of the World Wide Web, where do things stand now? Has the promise been fulfilled? Well, as a way to try to answer that, I'd like to tell you two short stories. The first is a story about Jade. Jade is a black woman in her mid-20s. She recently moved to New York and has actually spent the last few years trying to get her foot in the door of our industry. Now, she doesn't have a college degree, which has made her search difficult. But she also has one of the sharpest minds I know. I mean, she managed to teach herself HTML and CSS while holding down 2 or 3 part-time jobs at once. But even still, I mean, her lack of formal training and education has made it really hard for her to get interviews, much less job offers. Now, she actually recently got a job working in customer support for a startup, and she's actually incredibly excited about that. She will be the first to tell you that this is not exactly glamorous work. I mean, she fields customer emails and the odd phone support request, but she feels like she's finally got her foot in the door of the industry. And she's incredibly excited about that. I've known Jade all her life. Jade is my sister. She hates this photo. And I was thinking about Jade last May when Duplex took the stage at last year's Google I/O conference. And from that stage, Duplex made 2 phone calls, and I'd like to play you a brief excerpt of the very first one.
So how can I help you?
Hi, I'm calling to book a women's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd.
Sure, give me 1 second. Sure, what time are you looking for around?
At 12 p.m.
We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15.
Do you have anything between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m.?
I realize this sounds pretty mundane. Basically, in this recording, you may have heard Duplex calling to book an appointment at a hair salon. Now, Duplex may sound human, right down to the ums and ahs, but it's not. In reality, Duplex is actually a complex neural network that was built by Google, and it's capable of making phone calls and speaking to a human and completing simple transactions. Now, there is a lot to be said for how creepy Duplex is, or how ethically and morally problematic it might be. But when I first heard Duplex's recordings, the very first thing I thought of was Jade. I mean, her job requires her to reply to customer emails and occasionally offer phone support. It's a job that many in our industry would classify as, quote, unskilled. But what happens when Duplex or technologies like it become mainstream? I mean, what happens to Jade's job? What happens to Jade and the millions of men and women exactly like her? Now I'd like to tell you a story about a woman named Brenda. Brenda Munyongi is a single mother who lives in Kibera, which is considered the largest slum in Nairobi, and in fact it's considered the largest urban slum on the African continent. Now Brenda commutes 2 hours by bus to her job, where she works for a company that produces training data. Now, training data is basically something that's fed into machine learning algorithms to make them more accurate. Let me put it another way. Let's say you show an image recognition algorithm 1 million photos that you know contain cats. Well, then that algorithm is going to get uncannily good at identifying images that contain cats, which is pretty awesome, I think. Now, Brenda's job is, in fact, to create that training data. During her 8-hour shift, she and her fellow trainers will view many, many images on their computer screens. And on each image, Brenda will basically highlight areas of the image with a mouse and then label each region manually. The results of Brenda's work and the work of employees at Brenda's company will be used by companies like Microsoft, Salesforce, Amazon, and Google to fuel their artificial intelligence research. In other words, employees at Brenda's company are quite literally powering the platforms and profits of some of the world's biggest corporations. Employees at Brenda's company make around $9 a day. The most accurate trainers will receive a shopping voucher. Now, the BBC reporter who covered Brenda's story visited her company's headquarters here in San Francisco. And during that visit, he asked the CEO about the low pay of those workers.
Some of your clients are the biggest, richest companies in the world. Can they not afford to pay more than $9 a day for this work?
We make a guarantee to every single worker at Somasource that they are paid a living wage. If we were to pay people substantially more than that in some of the markets that we're in, we would throw everything off, and that would have actually a potentially negative impact on the cost of housing, the cost of food, et cetera, and the communities in which our workers live and thrive.
This is exploitation. And frankly, this is also a kind of design. I mean, none of this happened by accident. Hiring low-cost labor to perform rote, repetitive work is something that was intentionally and thoughtfully done. By opening offices in impoverished communities where wages are low, where worker protections are presumably non-existent, this company and their clients can maximize their gains while minimizing their costs. And imagine how precarious Brenda's job is. I mean, as image recognition technology improves, will her job still exist in a few years' time? And in fact, it's entirely possible that the data work she's doing today is being fed into automated solutions that will eventually replace her, which is, for better and for worse, a very common strategy in our industry. I mean, for one example, there's Facebook. I mean, modern social media companies struggle with content moderation, as many of you well know. In fact, if you've ever wondered to yourself how you can get through one day online without seeing truly disturbing content, it's thanks to the efforts of thousands of contract workers, each of them sorting through videos, through images, through individual posts, looking for anything that might potentially violate the company's terms of service. Now, I'd like to be very clear. This is incredibly stressful, in fact, traumatic work that's visited upon low-paid contractors. And more recently, Facebook has been investing in various automated approaches to flagging explicit content. And to do so, they've begun gathering data from their human reviewers and using that data to train moderation algorithms. I wanted to talk about this because our industry has a very rich history of treating certain classes of work as invisible and as ideal candidates for automation. And then those workers are ultimately forced to train the algorithms that may eventually replace them. And broadly speaking, this is what we're seeing at the corners of our industry. That the automated solutions we design are responsible both for creating exploitative working conditions for vulnerable workers, and they're also responsible for displacing and eliminating jobs. But here's the thing I want to suggest to you today, right now, that it's not just happening at the corners anymore. That our jobs, yours and mine, are just as vulnerable to these same effects of automation. Now, I hope this isn't seen as an especially controversial statement. I mean, our industry has always embraced automation as a potential good at various levels, right? I mean, from the task runners that you and I use in our work on a daily basis to more design-oriented utilities like remove.bg, which is a frankly remarkable website that uses artificial intelligence to instantly and automatically remove backgrounds from photos. Now, on a much grander scale, there's actually some staggering image personalization work coming out of Netflix. I mean, they've been personalizing not just video recommendations, but personalized artwork. That is, the cover art that appears on a given show or movie will change based on what you've seen in the past. Excuse me. So, for example, let's say you've watched a lot of romantic comedies. I mean, in that case, the cover artwork for something like Good Will Hunting might feature Matt Damon and Minnie Driver. However, if you tend to prefer comedies, and hey, who doesn't, then Robin Williams might be a little bit more prominently featured on that key art. Now, to deliver on this extreme level of personalization, Netflix created Ava, which is a suite of complex tools and software. Now, Ava uses facial detection and image analysis algorithms to scour videos for frames that have cinematic qualities. And then they feed those images into another recommendation algorithm that then basically selects the image that's best for you based on various profile markers. This is stunning work, and it's almost entirely automated. And in fact, it's because it was automated that this was a key motivator for Netflix in building these tools. Specifically, they said that as our original content slate continues to expand, our technical experts are tasked with finding new ways to scale our resources and alleviate our creatives from the tedious and ever-increasing demands of digital merchandising. I think that middle line spells it out pretty clearly, finding new ways to scale our resources. Netflix created an array of automated image production solutions not just to help improve engagement, but also because it would have been more expensive to hire enough designers to achieve an equivalent scale. As wildly impressive as this image customization technology is, I can't help but think of the design jobs that could potentially be impacted by it. Now, this brings me to last year when I saw this remarkable video made by the design systems team at Airbnb. Now, this is very brief, but a number of things happen in it very quickly. Now, in the video, a designer sketches a few shapes onto a piece of paper, and then they place that paper underneath a camera where the computer instantly analyzes the sketch and then renders a finished prototype in a browser. It's creating a real design simply by looking at the sketch. Now, it's able to do so because every single shape that's on that piece of paper corresponds to a specific pattern in the company's pattern library. Now, on a personal level, I have always dreamed of something like this, of being able to instantly translate my ideas into a real working prototype. And now that the technology is here, I can't help but feel a little bit scared of it. Now, please don't misunderstand me. This technology looks like a marvel, and this is a remarkable video, but I can't help but think of all the jobs that have traditionally sat between a rough sketch and a finished working prototype. The designers, the developers, the researchers, the product owners, the people involved in translating a rough idea into working shipping code. And I wonder what this technology means for them, for us, for you and me. So here's the way of it. Over the last few years, our industry has made countless ethical and moral lapses in the pursuit of scale. And with that scale comes a precariousness amongst its workers, amongst warehouse workers and contractors and administrators, and also including you and me. So given that, I'd like to make 3 suggestions to you. The first is that we are workers who make our living on the web. And as workers, we should have a voice in saying how our work is meant to be used. And then also as workers, we should have a voice in saying how and when automation is incorporated into our work. So keeping all that in mind, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do about this? Well, for me at least, I think we start with hope. I'd like to share a very tiny bit of one of my very favorite speeches with you. This was given by Cornel West, the American philosopher.
I don't believe in optimism. I don't believe in pessimism. Black folks saying I've been down so long, the down don't worry me no more, but I'll keep struggling anyway. That is not an optimistic statement nor a pessimistic statement. It's neither sentimental nor cynical. It's an expression of hope, and hope is not the same thing as optimism. Never confuse or conflate hope with optimism. Hope cuts against the grain. Hope is participatory. It's an agent in the world. Optimism looks at the evidence and see whether it allows us to infer that we can do X or Y. Hope says, I don't give a damn, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to do it anyway.
It's one of my favorite speeches. I can't recommend it highly enough. Now, I want to be very clear about something, is that Professor West is speaking from a very specific context here, that of struggling against the racial inequalities that Black Americans face on a daily basis. And I want to acknowledge that context. I want to honor that context. With that said, I feel that his definition of hope can also be useful for us here in this moment, in our industry. That hope is participatory. It's an agent in the world. I mean, in these times, I think we need to realize that hope is participatory, that hope takes action. Because in these times, it's absolutely true that we have so many, countless challenges in front of us, and it's easy to look at them and to feel overwhelmed, to feel despair. But we have just as many opportunities to take action, to redesign our industry to be more equitable and more just, but we need power to do it. And we also need to recognize that individually we lack that power. I mean, no single one of us can change Facebook's trajectory or Google's or Amazon's or any other large corporations. In fact, we're not unlike Starlings. We're beautiful in our way, and we've each done so many clever, brilliant things, but we're small, almost insignificant. But collectively, well, that's another matter entirely. Because after all, I mean, it's our design thinking, our engineering, our planning, our research, our work that has made the web what it is today. Collectively, we have quite literally designed and built these systems. When we work together, when we move together, what's to stop us from redesigning those same systems? We need to unionize, my loves. Yeah. Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you. Just to be clear, I don't mean this in an abstract sense or as a clever metaphor. I mean, we should recognize that we're not just web designers or web developers, but that we are workers. And as workers, we have an opportunity, if not an obligation, to organize our workplaces and to form unions. Now, a union means different things in different countries, and it means something very different in the United States. But fundamentally speaking, a union provides power and leverage. It allows workers to more equitably negotiate with their employers for better wages, better hours, better benefits, and all this is true and necessary. But maybe more critically, a union allows us to express solidarity with every worker at our companies, and it also helps to ensure that we're working collectively to protect each other. Now, if you'd like an example of an organized workplace in our industry, you don't actually have to look much further than Google. Now, as you might remember, last year held a litany of bad news for Google. I mean, first there was their foray into defense contracting, and then there was Project Dragonfly, their attempt to create a censored search engine for China that could potentially enable state surveillance. And then in late October, the New York Times reported that Google had protected 3 executives accused of sexual misconduct, including Andy Rubin, the founder of Android. According to the reporting, rather than firing the executives, Google paid each of them millions of dollars upon their departure, even though they were not legally required to do so. On November 1st, 1 week after the Times expose, 20,000 Google employees and contractors walked out of the company's offices around the world. And they presented Google's leadership with 5 demands, each of them representing the workers' calls for a safe working environment, for an end to the sexual harassment, the discrimination, and the systemic racism that they saw in their workplace. And they used the anger generated by the New York Times expose as fuel they could use to mobilize on these issues. Now, I want to be very clear. This mobilization didn't take an instant. It happened over the course of the year. And maybe more importantly, this isn't a union, not in the formal sense of the word. But for me, at least, it feels like we're witnessing the beginning of something. That this might be the beginning of a labor movement in the tech industry. A movement that might let us connect, share our concerns, and collectively work together on the issues before us. Because after all, we built this mess. We designed this mess. We have each of us participated in the creation of a World Wide Web, a network that spans the globe, that's capable of cruelty, of exploitation, and of enforcing vastly cruel inequalities. But it's also a web that can bring delight to people, that can educate people, that can connect people. The web has brought me here to this wonderful room for 2 whole days of incredible speakers, and it's brought you here too. And I'm grateful for that because I consider clarity to be a rare and beautiful opportunity, because it's events like this in which we can talk to each other, we can listen to each other. We can hear what we're concerned about. We can hear what we love about our jobs and what we wish were different. And it's in these connections that we can start to build solidarity, to consolidate our own kind of power. We are on a new adventure, you and I. There is so much work before us, work for us to design a better web, one that works more equitably for all. So let's start to move forward together, with heart, with strength, and with clarity. Because individually, we are capable of brilliant things. But collectively, we're a wonder. Let's get to work. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your time.